confused right now. Sitting in front of charts that used to feel like they were about to make sense, and now you're not sure they ever will. That's the feeling I want to start with. Because if that's where you are, if you're in that specific grinding, demoralizing place where you know enough to know you don't know enough, then I need you to hear this before anything else. Confusion in trading isn't a sign that you're doing it wrong. It's a sign that your mind is finally honest enough to admit it doesn't know. And that admission, that uncomfortable, unwanted, terrifying admission, is the actual beginning of mastery. Not the middle of it, not a prerequisite for it, the beginning of it. The confusion is the work starting. I know that doesn't feel like good news right now. I know that when you're in it, confusion feels like falling. It feels like a door closing rather than one opening. You started trading with some kind of vision of how this would go, a timeline, maybe a rough picture of what it would look like when you had it figured out. And here you are, and instead of having it figured out, you have more questions than you started with, more uncertainty, more awareness of how much you don't yet understand. And that awareness, which is actually evidence of growth, evidence of a mind developing in the right direction, feels like failure. Most traders quit right here, not after they lose all their money, though that happens too. They quit here in the confusion phase, before they've lost everything, when the gap between where they thought they'd be and where they actually are becomes too wide to tolerate. They quit not because they can't learn, but because they can't tolerate the feeling of not yet knowing while they are in the middle of learning it. That distinction matters. Read it one more time. They quit not because they can't learn, because they absolutely can, but because they can't tolerate the feeling of not yet knowing while they are in the middle of learning it. That feeling, the specific texture of being in between, of having left beginner certainty behind but not yet arrived at competence, of knowing just enough to see how much you still don't know. That feeling is the thing that destroys most traders. Not the market. The feeling, and here's what I want to say directly to you right now, if you're in that place. The fact that you're feeling it means you're still in it. The traders who quit don't talk about confusion as a phase they're working through. They talk about trading as something that didn't work for them. They've already located the problem outside themselves and moved on. You're still here, still asking questions, still trying to understand. That matters. That means the confusion hasn't beaten you yet. Let me tell you what confusion actually is in the context of learning to trade, because I think if you understand the mechanism, the feeling becomes slightly more bearable. When you first started trading, you had a model of the market in your head. That model was simple, maybe even naive. Price goes up when buyers are stronger than sellers. A pattern that looked like this worked last time. If I follow these rules, I should make money. The model felt coherent. It felt logical. And because it felt coherent, it felt safe. You knew what you were doing, or you thought you did. Then you got into the market and started accumulating actual experience. Real trades, real losses, real moments when the setup did exactly what it wasn't supposed to do. And each of those moments created a small crack in your original model. And as the cracks accumulated, the model, the simple, coherent, safe model, started to break down. And what lives in the space where the old model used to be, before the new and more accurate one is fully constructed, is confusion. Raw, uncomfortable, disorienting confusion. You're between models. The old one doesn't work, the new one isn't built yet. And in that space, every chart looks like noise. Every decision feels arbitrary. Every outcome feels random, not because it is, but because the mental framework you need to make sense of what you're seeing isn't there yet. That's the phase. That's what's happening. And the reason most traders don't make it through isn't that it's too hard intellectually. It's that it's too hard emotionally. The ego, that part of the self that needs to believe it's competent, that needs external validation, that needs to be somewhere on the journey where it's already arrived, cannot survive in confusion. The ego needs certainty, and the confusion phase offers none. Here is something I want you to start doing right now, today, before you open a single chart. I want you to write down 3 things you currently understand about markets. 3 things you feel genuinely confident about, even if they're small. Maybe it's something about how price reacts around a certain level. Maybe it's something about when volume matters. Maybe it's something you've observed repeatedly and that you've started to trust. 3 things. Write them down. Then below that, write down 1 thing you're confused about. 1 specific thing, not everything, not trading in general, but 1 defined area of confusion. Now look at both lists. That's your map. The first list is what you've built so far. The second is what the next layer of understanding is going to be built from. Confusion is not the absence of a map. It's the raw material the next section of the map gets made from. Now I want to go somewhere that might feel counterintuitive, because there's something about the confusion phase that I've noticed is actually dangerous in a specific way, and it's not the danger most people warn you about. The conventional wisdom says the danger in confusion is that you'll do something reckless, that you'll overtrade or blow your account trying to force things to make sense. And that danger is real. But there's another danger, quieter, more insidious. And I think for a lot of traders, more lethal. The danger is that you'll decide in the middle of your confusion to protect yourself from the feeling by learning more, by reading more books, watching more videos, buying more courses, absorbing more content, and the learning becomes a way to avoid trading, a way to feel like you're still on the path without having to endure the actual discomfort of being in the market while you don't yet understand it. I want to stop here because I have to tell you something about myself that I have not always been proud of. There was a period, a real specific, months-long period in my development as a trader when I was doing exactly this. I was consuming information at a remarkable rate, reading everything, studying everything, getting very, very good at talking about trading while being almost completely unable to trade. And I told myself I was building a foundation. I told myself I was being disciplined and methodical. But the truth, the honest, uncomfortable truth, is that I was hiding. The discomfort of not knowing while being in the market was so acute, so ego-threatening, so difficult to sit with, that I found a way to feel like I was trading without actually having to feel what it feels like to trade. You might be doing this too. If you are, I'm not judging it. I understand it completely. The confusion phase is genuinely hard to be in. But I want to tell you what I eventually understood. Information without exposure is anesthesia. It numbs the feeling without healing the underlying thing. And the underlying thing, the ability to sit in uncertainty with money on the line and still execute, can only be built by being in the market. Not in books about the market. In the market. This doesn't mean you shouldn't study. It means that study has to be paired with exposure, with real trades. Small trades if necessary, as small as you can make them while still having real money on the line, because only real money produces the real feeling that you need to learn to manage. Simulate all you want to develop pattern recognition, but do not confuse pattern recognition with the psychological skill of managing live uncertainty. They are completely different things. One lives in your intellect, the other lives in your nervous system. And your nervous system only learns through exposure. Here is the second practice step, and this one is specifically for the confusion phase. I want you to commit to a number of trades per week, whatever number feels slightly uncomfortable but manageable, and I want you to take exactly that many trades every week for the next 4 weeks. Not more on weeks when you're feeling good. Not fewer on weeks when you're confused or frustrated. Exactly the committed number. And after each trade, write one sentence. What did I feel at the moment I entered this trade? That's it. One sentence. 4 weeks. You are building two things simultaneously. The exposure that develops real psychological resilience, and a record of your emotional patterns that will eventually show you exactly where your development needs to focus. Now let me talk about the specific ways the confusion phase destroys traders, because I think naming them is the first step toward not being destroyed by them. The first way is the strategy carousel. This is the pattern where a trader gets confused by their results, concludes that the confusion is caused by a bad strategy, and switches to a new one. And when the new one produces confusion too, which it will, because the confusion isn't primarily about the strategy, they switch again and again. And over time, they have a collection of strategies, none of which they've used long enough to know whether they actually work, and they're more confused than they were at the start. Because each new strategy brought new rules, new concepts, new ways of reading the chart, and the accumulation of all of those, without a long enough period with any one of them, is its own kind of noise. The confusion phase requires you to stay with one thing long enough to get through it. This is almost impossibly hard, because the thing you've chosen will produce losses during the confusion phase. Some of those losses will be because the strategy isn't being executed properly. Some will be because no strategy wins every trade. But all of them will feel, in the moment, like evidence that the strategy is wrong and you need to switch. You don't. You need to develop. And development requires staying in place long enough to accumulate the experience that actually builds understanding. The second way the confusion phase destroys traders is what I think of as comparison collapse. This is when a trader in the middle of their confusion starts measuring themselves against traders who appear to have it figured out. Social media makes this catastrophically easy now. You can watch someone else's highlights, their winning trades, their clean setups, their confident analysis, and compare that against your own interior experience of confusion and self-doubt and losing trades. And the comparison is completely unfair. You're comparing your insides to their outsides. You're comparing your whole experience, including all the parts they never show, against the curated presentation they choose to make public. And out of that comparison comes the most dangerous thought in trading development. They have something I don't, and maybe I never will. That thought, that specific, quiet, identity-level thought is where most traders' development actually ends. Not in a dramatic blown account, in a slow withdrawal of belief. A quiet conclusion that mastery is for other people. And once that conclusion forms, the confusion phase doesn't lead to the next phase. It leads out of trading entirely. Here's the third practice step, and it's the most important one for where you are right now. Stop measuring your progress against other traders. Immediately. Not because their progress is irrelevant, but because you don't have access to their actual journey, only their presentation of it. Instead, I want you to find one trade from 3 months ago, one specific trade, and write down what you were thinking when you took it. Then, write down what you would think about that same setup today. If there's any difference, if you see anything now that you didn't see then, that's growth. That's real, measurable, personal growth that has nothing to do with anyone else's timeline. Your only valid comparison is to the trader you were 3 months ago. And almost always, that comparison is more encouraging than you expect. Let me talk about what happens on the other side of the confusion phase. Not to give you a destination to rush toward, because rushing is one of the things that keeps people in the confusion phase longer than necessary, but because I think knowing what's coming makes the present more bearable. What happens on the other side is not that the uncertainty disappears. I've said this before and I'll keep saying it. The uncertainty never disappears. What happens is that your relationship to the uncertainty changes. You develop what I would describe as familiarity with the unknown. You've been in enough uncertain situations, with enough real money on the line, that the feeling of not knowing what the next candle will do stops triggering a survival response. It becomes background noise. You can think through it rather than reacting to it. And when you can think through uncertainty rather than react to it, your decision-making improves dramatically. Not because you know more, because you've practiced being in the presence of not knowing without it shutting you down. That is what the confusion phase builds, if you stay in it. It isn't building your knowledge of setups or your understanding of market structure, though those develop too. It's building your capacity for discomfort, your tolerance for not yet, your ability to function in the middle of a process that hasn't resolved yet. And those capacities, precisely because they are so uncomfortable to develop, become the things that almost no one else has. The thing that separates the traders who make it from the ones who don't isn't intelligence or talent or even market knowledge. It's the willingness to stay in the confusion phase long enough to come through it. The traders who make it are not the ones who figured it out faster. They are the ones who decided, at some point, that the confusion was part of the deal. That it was not evidence of failure, but the texture of growth. That every day they stayed in it was a day they were building something real, even when, especially when, it didn't feel that way. I want to close with something that I think is the most honest thing I can say about this phase, because I think honesty is what this moment requires more than encouragement. The confusion phase is hard, not moderately hard, genuinely, legitimately, ego-threateningly hard. It requires you to keep showing up in a state of not knowing, to take actions whose outcomes you cannot predict, to sit with losses that feel like verdicts and wins that feel accidental. It requires you to watch your confidence erode and keep going anyway. It requires you to believe in a process you can't yet see working. That is a lot to ask of a person. I know it is. I've been there. And I want to tell you, as directly as I know how to say it, if you are still in it, if you are still confused and still trying and still showing up, you are already doing the hardest part. Most people don't make it this far. The ones who quit left before the confusion got this deep, or they left the moment it arrived. You're in the middle of it and you're still here. That's not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. The confusion doesn't last forever. It breaks. Not all at once, usually in small moments of unexpected clarity that come after weeks of fog. One morning, you'll look at a chart and see something you didn't see the week before. One trade will resolve in a way that makes a concept real rather than theoretical. One session will end, and you'll realize that you didn't make any of the mistakes that used to happen automatically. Those moments are small. They don't feel like arriving, but they are. That's what arriving looks like in trading. Not a dramatic breakthrough, small, quiet accumulations of competence that only become visible when you look back. You're building something real. Even now, especially now, stay in the confusion. It's doing its work. If this channel has given you something useful today, not just information, but something that shifted how you see where you are, stay close. Every video here is built for a trader who is in the middle of something hard, because that's where growth actually happens. Not in the easy phases, in the phases exactly like the one you're in right now. Subscribe if you want more of this. Not for us, for you. I want to come back to something I said earlier about the strategy carousel, because there's a dimension of it that I glossed over and that deserves its own space. The strategy carousel is destructive not just because it prevents you from developing mastery with any single approach. It's destructive because every time you abandon a strategy in the middle of confusion, you teach yourself something. You teach yourself that confusion is a reason to stop. And once that lesson is installed, once your nervous system has learned that the appropriate response to confusion is to look for something new, you will apply that lesson everywhere. In your next strategy, in the one after that. In any system you ever try to develop, the lesson generalizes. The confusion reflex becomes automatic. This is why I feel so strongly that staying with one approach through the confusion phase is not just about the approach itself. It's about breaking the reflex. It's about teaching yourself through repeated experience that confusion is not a stop sign, that confusion is a tunnel. And tunnels, if you keep moving through them, eventually open up. The traders who have developed this, who have been through the tunnel enough times that they no longer need certainty before they can move, carry something with them into every market, every setup, every session that can't be bought or studied or shortcut. They carry the lived experience of having been in the dark and kept going. And that experience, that particular form of confidence that isn't arrogance but is simply the quiet knowledge of what you're capable of, is the thing that makes a trader bulletproof. Not from losses, not from bad days, but from the kind of internal collapse that ends most traders' journeys. Let me also talk about the role that your relationship with money plays in the confusion phase, because I think it's underappreciated. Most traders who are confused are also financially anxious about their trading. They need the account to grow by a certain amount by a certain date, or they're using money they can't truly afford to lose, or they've told someone, a partner, a parent, themselves a story about where this is going and they feel accountable to that story. And all of that financial pressure creates a very specific kind of urgency that makes the confusion phase significantly harder to navigate. Because urgency and confusion are incompatible. Confusion requires patience. Confusion requires the willingness to stay in a process without knowing when it will resolve. Urgency demands resolution now. And when urgency meets confusion, the result is almost always the same. The trader shortcuts the process. They take bigger positions to make up for lost time. They force setups that aren't there. They abandon a developing approach because it isn't producing results fast enough. And each of those shortcuts extends the confusion phase rather than resolving it. This is why I have always said that the most important thing you can do before you start serious trading development is to resolve the money pressure. Not to become wealthy, just to remove the deadline, to find a way to be financially okay, whether this works in 6 months or 3 years. Because the internal timeline you're working against is the invisible hand that pushes most traders into every bad decision they ever make. Remove the deadline, and the confusion becomes workable. Keep the deadline, and every day in the confusion phase is a day of increasing desperation that makes clear thinking almost impossible. I know that's easier said than done. I know that financial pressure is real, and that not everyone has the luxury of trading without urgency. But even if you can't eliminate the pressure entirely, naming it, knowing it's there, knowing how it affects your decisions, knowing the ways it's likely to compromise your judgment gives you a small but meaningful amount of protection. You can't neutralize a force you can't see, but you can work around one you've named. Let me tell you about the moment the confusion phase began to break for me, because I think it might help you recognize the same moment when it comes for you. I had been in the market for what felt like too long without feeling like I understood what I was doing. I was following rules, I was studying, I was journaling, and the confusion was still there. Still that background hum of not quite understanding that made every session feel like a test I hadn't studied enough for. And then one afternoon I took a trade that should have been a loss. Everything pointed to it being wrong. I had entered slightly late. The structure was marginal. The setup wasn't clean. And while I was in it, before the outcome resolved, I noticed something. I noticed that I wasn't afraid. Not because the trade was going well, hadn't done anything yet, but because I had been in enough uncertain trades that my body had learned the shape of this moment. The uncertainty was familiar. And in that familiarity, there was a kind of calm I hadn't felt before. Not confidence in the outcome. Something better. Comfort with the not knowing. The trade ended up being a small winner. But that wasn't the moment that mattered. The moment that mattered was the minute before, when I realized I could be fully present in uncertainty without the fear response taking over. That was the first real sign that the confusion phase was cracking. Not because I understood the market better, though I did, but because I had developed the capacity to function inside, not understanding, without being destroyed by it. That capacity is what's being built right now in every session you show up to while you're confused. Every trade you take without knowing exactly what you're doing but following your rules anyway. Every chart you sit with and try to read, even though you're not sure you're reading it right. That's the work, and it is working, even when you can't feel it working. The confusion phase has a direction. It is moving you somewhere, even when it feels like you're standing still. Trust the direction, stay in the movement, let the confusion do what it came to do. That's all mastery is. Confusion that you stayed in long enough. I want to address one more thing before we close today, because I've been talking about the confusion phase largely from the inside, from the perspective of what it feels like to be in it. But there's also an outside perspective worth considering, and it has to do with what other people see when they watch a trader going through this phase. From the outside, a trader in the confusion phase looks inconsistent. They take a great trade, then a terrible one. They have a week of discipline followed by a week where they broke every rule they set. They seem to know things, they talk intelligently about the market, they reference concepts correctly, and then they do things in the market that contradict everything they say they know. From the outside, this looks like a character problem, like lack of discipline, like someone who just can't get it together. But from the inside, you know it's not that simple. You know that the gap between knowing and doing is real, that the version of you sitting calmly and discussing your rules is a different version from the one sitting in a live trade with real money moving against you. You know that the breakdown between those two versions isn't a failure of willpower, but a genuine developmental gap that is in the process of closing. The outside doesn't see that. The outside sees inconsistency. And if you're getting feedback from people around you, partners, friends, people who care about you and are watching you, trade some of that feedback is probably painting you as less capable than you actually are. This is important to name because the confusion phase is already hard enough without absorbing a narrative about yourself that isn't accurate. You are not undisciplined. You are in development. Those are completely different things. An undisciplined person doesn't care about the gap between their rules and their behavior. A person in development is actively working on closing it. If you're watching this video, you are a person in development. Hold on to that distinction, because the story you tell yourself about who you are as a trader will, over time, become the trader you are. Make sure the story is accurate. Here's the last thing I want to leave you with, and it's a reframe that I think you'll return to many times in the weeks and months ahead. The confusion phase is not a problem to be solved. It's a price to be paid. Every trader who has ever developed real mastery paid this price. Every one of them sat in the confusion, felt the uncertainty, doubted themselves, lost trades they thought they understood, made mistakes they thought they'd already learned from, and came back the next day anyway. Not because it felt good, because they had decided that the destination was worth the cost. You're paying the price right now. Every day you stay in the confusion and keep working, you're paying. And the payment is not wasted. It is not lost. It is being stored in the exact place where real trading ability lives, not in your knowledge, not in your strategy, but in the part of you that has been in the uncomfortable place and survived it. That part grows stronger every time you don't quit. So here's your mantra for this phase. Not a motivational phrase, a functional one. Something to repeat, not to feel better, but to stay oriented. Say it to yourself before every session. The confusion is the work. The confusion is the work. Not a sign that the work isn't happening. The actual work itself. When you sit down to trade and don't know exactly what you're doing, but you show up anyway, you are doing the work that most people never do. You are earning something real. The confusion will break. Not on your timeline, on its own timeline. And when it does, you'll look back at this phase not as the time trading tried to defeat you, but as the time trading made you. Not in spite of the confusion, because of it. Stay. Keep working. You're closer than it feels.